Okay, so thanks, Randy, so much for the invitation to this fantastic conference. I'll move us back onto the foreign policy implications of Trump rather than Trump himself. And I'm going to be talking about the end of engagement, expertise, domestic politics, and US-China strategy under Trump. I'll just to briefly overview, we'll talk about a marked shift in US strategy towards China since the election of 2016, namely the precipitous decline of engagement. I'll then explore some plausible explanations before developing my own, which centers on the transmission of China expertise to American policymakers in the changing domestic political context. I'll end, time allowing, with some implications and perhaps even predictions. Okay, so let's get going. So the puzzle then is a sea change in US-China, America's approach to China since approximately 2017, a shift from a frame of engagement to one known as strategic competition, increasingly known as strategic competition, or great power competition is another term often used. Engagement was an approach that hoped to integrate Beijing into the Western-led international order, the rules-based international order, RBIO often termed, and the shift to strategic competition has pushed engagement firmly to one side, and in its place is a way of describing world politics as one of a return of great power competition, with the United States and China locked in perhaps even a new Cold War. Okay, so the shift is sort of typified by national security strategy documents from 2015 and then later documents in 2017 and 2018. So here we see Obama and Xi in happier times, and the February 2015 National Security Strategy welcomed the rise of a stable, peaceful, and prosperous China, seeking to develop a constructive relationship, noting long-standing differences of opinion on human rights, etc., but still hoping for cooperation where cooperation was possible. In comes Trump, and a different approach begins to solidify, typified by an initial shift in the December 2017 National Security Strategy that framed a new threat to American national interests by China and Russia. And the Russia angle is interesting. I'm not going to talk about it much, the distinction between China and Russia, because sometimes Russia's lumped in as a great power competitor, sometimes it isn't, for obvious domestic political reasons. And also you'll see there on the right a description of what went wrong with engagement. So for decades, US policy was rooted in the belief that support for China's rise would liberalize China, and it hasn't happened, quite the opposite. The bottom left, the United States Strategic Approach to the People's Republic of China, was a document put out by the White House in May of this year that really solidified fully that strategic competition is now America's approach to China. What explains this shift is the basis for my paper and broader project. I'm going to talk through 4 existing explanations based on the idea that engagement failed, that this is all really about Trump and his dislike of China, long-standing dislike of China. A third is a more familiar sort of realist change in the balance of power type argument, that really this is about a newfound aggressiveness on China's part. And fourth, and linked, is a sort of a broader macro-historical structural realist argument based on the effects of China's rise. Graham Allison's Thucydides trap sort of encapsulates that. None of these explanations are wrong per se, but they're all partial, and they leave really important unanswered questions, namely how, why now, why not 10 years ago or earlier? And so they really clue into a more processual social argument that I will be putting forward here. Okay, so let's talk through these quickly. So top left, we have the famous argument by Kurt Campbell, who was in Clinton's State Department on the China side of things, and Eli Ratner, who was who's a think tanker and worked with Biden, who put out a sort of a very strong statement in Foreign Affairs saying that America's approach to China had been a failure, engagement had been a failure. The idea that China was going to come into the international order on America's terms was never going to happen, and we need to realize that. We need a China reckoning. Now, there is something to that argument, but for many experts, it's not the case that engagement failed, but it actually succeeded far too much. It brought China in, it enriched American elites at the expense of American non-elites, and much of the reasons for the voting for Trump was precisely to do with the inequities that engagement successes had helped create, opening the floodgates to unrestricted outsourcing and unprecedented reliance on China, which COVID has shown. Another failure of this argument that engagement failed as a policy is the argument that around 10 years or so ago, there was a strong case that made that engagement had failed and that a new approach was needed, particularly by the journalist James Mann, who made a similar argument in the book from 2007 called The China Fantasy, which was a well-written book and well received, but didn't have anything like the same splash in American national security circles that the China reckoning had. So why now? And is it the case that engagement has really failed? The second argument that I'm going to try to knock down is that this was only about Trump's election. Now, Trump's election is absolutely crucial, as we'll see, and his appointment brought in people that were very skeptical on the China side of things. So here we see on the top right, Robert Lighthizer and Peter Navarro, trade representatives, and they've been influential in pushing for the trade war that was launched in the summer of 2018. Now, this is going to be an important part of my argument, but the change must be broader than Trump's White House, because Trump is relying on a number of experts and views within the American national security community, particularly among China experts. And so it can't be laid just at Trump's door. So we need to think a little bit more carefully about the actual effect of Trump on long-standing understandings of China. And I'm going to say we need to push into the China expert community in the national security sphere in the United States. Bottom right, we see man-made islands in the South China Sea, which typifies a change in China's foreign policy approach, a newfound aggressiveness. Many people dated to 2008, 2009, and the post-financial crisis, post-Beijing Olympics, and then in 2010, 2011, the rise of Xi Jinping and a new authoritarianism in China. I'm not trying to downplay the argument that China has changed and that China is becoming more, shall we say, forthright in its foreign policy in a way that it wasn't 20 to 30 years ago. The point again is, why now? Why 2016, not 2014? So for example, in the early 2010s, at Scarborough Shoal, the United States tried to make a stand with the Philippines to kick China off a small disputed reef. And eventually the Chinese outlasted us, and we retreated with our tail between our legs, particularly one Kurt Campbell, who was sent to do the negotiating for the United States. Why exactly is it taken until 2016, and really only now until 2019, 2020, to take a strong stand against China? The final quadrant there is a nice little Google search for the Thucydides, for the Peloponnesian War and the Thucydides trap. I'm not going to sort of spend too much time knocking down that argument, because I think I'm adopting a broadly speaking constructivist approach, which sees that structural changes in the global balance of power can be very important, but the point is to understand how they work. They need to be interpreted. They don't just occur naturally. As Randy nicely said, you know, it might be good to go and ask people why they changed their views, and that's what I'm going to do. So together, the four arguments of policy of engagement changed because it was a policy failure, because of Trump, because China changed, or because of the structural effects of the changes in the rise and decline of powers, are all partial explanations that need to be augmented with a new, different approach. So how should we do this? Well, the first thing to understand is what engagement was. In the contemporary sort of discourse about it, the argument is that it was a strategy. And here we do link into the argument of the entire conference, which is what are sort of grand strategies, what are the relationship between regional strategies underpinning US grand strategies. What I would say is that engagement wasn't a single thing, and it actually wasn't a strategy in any straightforward sense. In fact, we see, even from just a very crude measure of a Google Ngram search, we see that engagement as a term popped up in the mid to late 1990s and then declined again after China entered the World Trade Organization. So it was a term that emerged after the end of the Cold War, was popularized under the Clinton administration, and was central to the arguments of the Clinton administration to try to get WTO accession for China through a very skeptical Congress. So what this shows is that engagement wasn't a clear, coherent strategy named as such all the way from 1972 until 2016. There's something more going on, and we need to think a little bit more deeply about what it was. So what I do in a newer version of the paper than the one I uploaded was to try to show that it has at least three aspects or faces. One is a set of aspects of policy, engagement as the series of decisions, processes, and events in US-China relations that have underpinned the argument, the idea of closer cooperation with China to try to bring them into the world, to the rules-based international order. So here we see strategic dialogues, and particularly what I'll talk about a little bit more is the policy of not trying to anger Beijing and keeping disputes like human rights, etc., the occasional crises like the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Serbia in 1999, keep those down and make sure that they don't create broader crises. But the two more important aspects that I'm going to talk about more today are engagement as a frame. What interviewees told me is a sort of a master narrative or meta-narrative about US-China relations and where China's rise is headed and what that means for the United States. That's distinct from policy and frames policy in a broader way. Policies fit within frames, as scholars of political rhetoric have told us. And the third aspect of strategy is its community aspect. It has a basis in the US national security community as a set of relations between successive governments, and particularly China experts in Washington, DC and beyond. And as a community, engagement underpinned a bipartisan approach to China from 1972 onwards, and the opening with Nixon and Kissinger through normalization in 1979 under Carter, and even weathering crises like Tiananmen Square and the Taiwan Straits crisis in 1996. Now, my argument in short then is that the end of engagement is the sidelining of a certain type of expert who was predominant within the national security community on the China side of things that has helped change the predominant frame of US-China relations in the US government, which is then leading to policy shifts, the likes of which we've seen attacking Huawei, banning TikTok and WeChat, various other policy changes such as banning certain imports from Xinjiang linked to human rights violations in the region. So engagement then is not a single thing, it has at least three aspects, and it's actually a little bit confusing to call it a strategy. It's a useful shorthand, but it's not particularly accurate. So let's talk a little bit more about these two aspects that I think that need to be unpacked more carefully, which is engagement as frame and engagement as community. So engagement as frame then is this, as I've said, master or meta-narrative about US-China relations. And before 2016, broadly speaking, the meta-narrative was that although the United States and China have all sorts of problems, and that China perhaps is a long-term challenger for the United States, and China is a very different type of polity and the United States and China are not going to be best friends, at least their differences can be managed and China can be incorporated into the international order, that the benefits outweigh the costs. After 2016, that frame has shifted to the notion that China is an immediate geopolitical competitor and an economic threat and not an opportunity, that national interests are no longer in the direction of trying to bring China into the international community, but to try to create a new understanding of relations that are more like terms such as containment, which have been brought back into the discussion after going dormant at the end of the Cold War, with a lot of baggage from the Cold War. So then the question becomes, well, who gets to write this frame, right? And here we have to actually move beyond the national security community, because it's not the case that they're the only framers of the US national interest. And so we have to look at least 3 or 4 areas where the national interests and frameworks of the national interest get constructed. The first big one is business lobbies. Business lobbies are absolutely crucial, and all the way through the 1990s, large firms, both individually and through chambers of commerce and business councils, were lobbying for engagement. So they are one important parcel of the story. The second one is the military. The military have an enormously powerful role in framing the national interest, in framing what China's rise means for the United States. And then the third is actually in some ways less important in normal times, and that is the national security community, IR scholars, as a small but occasionally influential part of that, and think tanks, journalists, etc. So you have business lobbies, the military, and then this broader academic think tank space. Now, the crucial preconditions for engagement, and therefore for its decline, were during the 1990s and the Cold War, and into the 2000s, military priorities were not with China. China under the Cold War was a state that could be brought on against the Soviet Union. And then into the 1990s, all the way up to, I would argue, about 2015, US priorities on the military side were in the Middle East after 1990. And you see this in speeches given well into 2014, 2015. At that point, remember, it was the fight against the Islamic State in the Levant. Right? All the way into the 2010s, we're still really prioritizing what was going on in the Middle East. And you see this in terms of the administrative bureaucratic turf war. Central Command was much more powerful than Pacific Command. Part of the story of the end of engagement is the resurgence of Pacific Command against Central Command, and the Pacific Command trying to get the US Navy to a 500 ship Navy rather than, at the moment, a low 300 ship Navy. China has a bigger Navy than us, for the first time, a genuine great power competitor, and that's freaking out the Navy. The second key component then is the business community, which again, Boeing and other firms in the early 1990s were very, very forthright trying to lobby for most favored nation and subsequently WTO membership. That shifts after 2008, 2009, when the business community started to get annoyed about intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and the devaluation of, or the undervaluation of the renminbi. So crucially, for the first time since the 1960s, in a short window between 2008, 2009, and 2016, and the initiation of the trade war, the business community is not strongly lobbying for engagement. So those two together, business and the military, are two important preconditions for engagement's demise. But to understand how engagement actually failed and why strategic competition has replaced it, we need to go into the third component of who gets to write the frame and think about the engagement as a community. So if we think about engagement as a community, then it is a set of relations between successive governments and the China expert community that underpinned bipartisan strategy since the 1970s. And the end of engagement then is the sidelining of a certain type of pro-engagement China expert and its replacement with a different type Tim has already used the term habitus, and I think that's an important one to sort of keep in mind, because it's a different type of person who have different dispositions towards China, more academic, access-based on the side of engagement, more military, less interested in pleasing China for the new folks, which I'll describe in a second. I won't spend any time.
Can I just break it for 1 second? I think it would just be nice if you clicked on from current slide at the top there. Do you see? Because that way I could see the people and your slide.
Yeah, there you go. Sorry, I tried. I hoped I could do that, but it turned. Perhaps I can. Great. So is that better?
Yeah.
Super. Thank you, Randy. I appreciate it. That's excellent. So, engagement as community then. A set of relations between successive governments and the China expert community that underpinned engagement. And this is to try to put people, faces, social groups back at the center of our understanding of who makes strategy, how strategies rise and fall. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time on methods. Happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But basically, for fortuitous reasons, in 2015, I decided to start studying US-China relations and spending a lot of time in Washington, D.C., doing a lot of interviews with China experts across the spectrum, from academia through current and former policymakers, former ambassadors, to eventually well over 100 interviews, in addition to a bunch of China watching events. On any given day in Washington, D.C., there is at least 1 or 2 China watching events, book talks, panel discussions. It is, as one interviewee explained to me, a permanent conference on China. Okay, so the China watchers, I always feel a little bit cheeky putting up people's faces without, because this is where the rubber hits the road. Ultimately, US foreign policy is made by particular individuals. And so here we see some of the headline names of the community of China watchers in the United States, which is a community of somewhere between 40 and 10,000 people, depending on how you want to frame what exactly a China watcher is. It, as some people describe to me, it has sort of concentric circles. You have top think tankers at its center, former policymakers at its center, and then you spread out to even graduate students of some of you, IR professors perhaps, who are aspiring China watchers. So it's people knowledgeable in some area of China's politics, history, or society, and numbers anywhere from the hundreds to the thousands. And they're struggling over what I call China capital, which is this sort of, sense that you have something important to say about China. You have something unique. Now, you can get that from policy experience. You can get that from time spent in China. You get that from Chinese language abilities. So there isn't one distinct form of China capital, but long-standing interest and focus on China with some language ability and time spent there is crucial. So just to very briefly name names, so we have Robert Zoellick, top left, Susan Shirk, a 1990s policymaker, David Shambaugh, top right, Mike Swain, Jeff Bader, Mike Lampton, Ezra Vogel, Bonnie Glaser, and Step Roy, bottom right, was a former ambassador. But there's many others. They form what I call an interstitial field. They are think tankers, academics. Some of them work for consultancy firms such as McCourt Associates, or the Center for Strategic Budgetary Assessments. What interstitial refers to is the fact that they cross more established social arenas like the academy, the government, and the think tank space, and the business, or the media. Now, anyone who's ever tried to get their research to speak to a policy audience and then an academic audience, and Tim has already sort of shown this, you'll be able to understand the different social dynamics going on in 2 different social spaces. So Tim, you're trying to get a piece of artwork out there on who votes for Trump, and there'll be certain types of claims one would have to make, but to an academic audience, you have to talk about rigor of your methodology, etc. So China expert community is an interstitial space. It exists across these more established social arenas. It is also, and I'm not going to emphasize this too much today, very much a Washington, D.C. thing. And I'm hoping Dan Dresner might be sort of able to see what I'm trying to do with something like this, to really see what politics is like inside the Beltway. So a couple of great quotes where a junior think tanker said that DC is the epicenter of China watching. Even compared to Beijing, there's much more visible people doing it in Washington, DC. Even compared to Beijing. So that shows that China watching is in many ways an American thing. You don't have anything like this in other countries. Or you can swing a cat at the corner of 18th and K Street in Washington. You're bound to hit someone who claims to be an expert who actually is one. And I can attest to that when I'm strolling down there and I see an important China expert just walking the other way. And I'm like, oh, that person's absolutely right. This town is full of China folks. Okay. So engagement then was really more than a strategy. It reflected a set of relationships between the US government and the community of China experts within the US national security community more broadly over time. A configuration of China experts inside and outside the government fostered a pro-cooperation approach to Beijing that emerged in the lead up to the opening to China in 1972 and subsequent normalization, and survived crisis points, continuing till around 2016. The end of engagement then is an effective processes, part political, part professional, that have resulted in the sidelining of this group of China experts. As one senior think tank has told me, in clear terms, this was a specific group that one could name the key people in it. They said Susan was in it, Susan Shirk. Ken Lieberthal was in it, Mike Oxenberg, he was an NSC person in the late 70s. These were all in the group. William Perry was in it, so was Ashton Carter, and Kurt Campbell to an extent too. Although when he says mugged by reality, Ashton Carter then migrated a bit on the topic is kind of a telling quote. So what then happens under Trump? Well, what happens under Trump is Trump severs the connections between the White House and this group of China experts who were broadly speaking pro-engagement. He imports a set of advisors previously outside the mainstream in their views of China, among them Peter Navarro, Robert Lighthizer, Michael Pillsbury, who advocated a much tougher line in the economic and military spheres on China. They told Trump that China already is an enemy and that engagement has been a failure, and we shouldn't try to resist policymaking because we might annoy the Chinese. In fact, we should do exactly what we need to do to counter things like forced technology transfers and Chinese industrial espionage, and not worry about Beijing's displeasure, because Beijing has already shown us its true nature. So appointments to key roles in the National Security Council, here Matthew Pottinger's key, State Department, Mike Pompeo is key, and at the Pentagon, Randy Shriver and Mark Esper have solidified this China is an enemy view. From this perspective, the end of engagement is much more than a strategic shift. It's a paradigm change in the types of expertise underpinning America's approach to China. It is a policy shift, a frame shift, and a community shift. Trump is simply not listening to the National Committee of US-China Relations. He's not listening to the Brookings Institution. He's not listening to the US Business Council. He's relying on individuals located at various different places in the US national security community that were where an institutionalized view of what you can call anti-engagement actually became prominent. Here, the effects of China's accession to the World Trade Organization become really interesting, because part of the agreement to get China into the WTO in 2000 created two congressional commissions, one on the human rights side, one on the economics and security side. And what those did was create organizations where a more skeptical view of engagement could become heard and could become legitimized within the academic, scholarly, think tank discussion about China's rise. And interestingly, one of those, which is called the US-China Congressional Executive Commission, is where a more anti-China view on the trade side became solidified, which is what Peter Navarro, particularly, and Robert Lighthizer, and the trade war, where that comes from. Now, Tim, this goes back into your story, because that's exactly the type of view that many people who were concerned about the loss of manufacturing jobs to China in the 1990s and 2000s, that was their view given more prominence. But in office, what has been stripped from that view is the idea of any sort of pro-labor implications of it. And more, what has been more sort of highlighted is the military security aspects of it. So we see here how disaffection at the individual level of Americans gets morphed into policymaking in quite a different way. Okay. So the other effect of Trump coming in is to let the lid off many people across government departments who have been, for the last 20 years or so, itching to maybe investigate Chinese industrial espionage, investigate Chinese spying, or push back against Chinese actions in the South China Sea, but also here in the United States in influence campaigns. We see the very rapid death of Confucius Institutes as one key example. So what one senior think tanker told me was, from my point of view, the arguments that I'm hearing that engagement was wrong have been heard for 25 years. The same people from the same parts of the political spectrum had those views. The difference was, for all administrations up through the end of Obama's first term at the White House, at the most senior levels, there was a view that supported engagement and sought to pursue both managing or dealing with the frictions and differences, enhancing cooperation. But now what's happened is, because of the top levels of the White House, it's sort of bashed China all the time. The FBI, the DOD, DHS, all these people have been consistently on the leash, and they're not anymore. Okay. So then the question becomes, well, who are these people who are more sort of skeptical of China? How have they got into top levels of government? And what's happening in the broader China sphere? Once hopeful of liberal political change, the paradigm shift in US policy has prompted a period of profound introspection among America's China watching community. In diverse offline and online fora, China watchers have vigorously debated whether engagement has failed, whether there's a new consensus on the need to replace it. Crucial to this is the fact that the very nature of the expertise of the China skeptics, shall we say, or hogs, is frequently very different from the pro-engagement types at their Brookings, Carnegie Endowment, Johns Hopkins locations. Many of the classical markers of China expertise, language competence, etc., prestige within the academic fields, like top programs like Berkeley, Columbia, and Michigan, are tainted with engagement. Many of the louder voices in the conversation and appointments are from people with very, very different forms of expertise. And here, one interview sort of told me exactly the dynamics of how this works. Many of the people who are skeptical of China think that China is already an enemy, feel as though they were sidelined for so long for making these arguments. And not only sidelined, but mocked because they didn't seem to have the sort of classical China education that the engagers had. So, so one interview says, before 2012, the pro-engagement experts ridiculed people like me. They mocked us. They said we didn't get China. We didn't go there. We didn't get hosted. But precisely because the pro-engagement experts did go to China, did get hosted, did get banquets, it's a former naval intelligence officer said they were effectively being brought in by what he called barbarian handlers. These were people who were handled by the Chinese to put forward a pro-China view to underpin engagement. So where are we in the China community then is the sidelining of the old engagement folks, the bringing in of new China experts who are not of the same bases, frequently from the military or from journalism perhaps as well, from the business sphere, and also at the same time a shift in the center of gravity among the whole China community to the prominence of people who are now in the center but are actually more skeptical of China than the old engagers were. So here we see the Council on Foreign Relations, Liz Economy, bottom left, CSIS, Bonnie Glaser, top right, top left, Aaron Freeberg and Eli Ratner, who 10, 15 years ago would have been understood as much more sort of hawkish, but now they're really in the center of things. And these are the types of people that might be brought in should Biden win in a few weeks. So the implications for IR theory, for the debate on grand strategy, and for the China future of China policy is that we need to understand the varied inputs into the creation of a strategy or an approach, to think about it as a multifaceted thing that mixes politics with a story of expert struggle. It raises interesting questions about how then we can still have rational debate, which in some ways was chimed into with our discussion earlier, because in a similar way that pro-Trump and anti-Trump folks find it very difficult to come together, pro-engagement and anti-engagement folks find it very difficult when someone is saying, well, you mocked me for 20 years, you said I was an idiot, and the other person is saying, well, hang on, you're saying that I'm in bed with the Chinese. That's not a very good basis for rational policy making. And there is the consequent danger of threat escalation, right? Is it really the case that the Chinese are, as one interview put it, out to clean our clocks? You know, we need to be very careful about what we say, and not let sort of social factors defending one's career, say, shift our views. So in terms of predictions, where we might go, there's a few different routes forward.
David, could I just, you can hear me?
Sure,
you gotta
yeah.
wrap it up real quick because we have a discussant, and I want to, there's so many people here that are gonna have so much to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, very quickly, Trump could, if he gets in again, create a grand bargain with Xi, sell Taiwan down the river, or if Biden gets in, then it'll be this more skeptical, not hawkish, but skeptical views, so we'll get more of strategic competition. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great, thank you so much, that was great. Haoming, try to keep it to 7 minutes. Haoming Xiong, he's one of our great grad students. They're all great, that's why they're here. Go ahead, I don't see your picture. There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Dr. McCourt. I think this is a really informative presentation and paper as well. I really enjoy reading it. So in IR, we are very into the 3 levels of analysis, but when it comes to the US tensions or maybe the end of US-China strategy in recent years, I think many studies tend to focus primarily on the structural factors like power transition or individual factors such as Trump's personal characteristics. So I think even for those who emphasize the importance of domestic politics, not many has touched on the role of China experts in influencing the US-China foreign policy. So yeah, that's what I'm thinking, like this project has opened the black box for us. And for me, it's really interesting. So I want to say one point that like the most intriguing or perhaps surprising findings in the project is that like the pro-engagement view in the US, as Dr. McCourt has pointed out, is very highly politicized perspective. So it has created very strange backflows in the debate and crossed the line of left and right. Like human rights advocates have found common causes with the hawks and opposed the pro-engagement, while as the liberals who prefer a grand strategy of restraint may align with the leftist critiques of military industrial complex. So I think it seems that like Trump's rise to power has reshuffled the China community in the US so that the general consensus, perhaps the so-called consensus on engagement, has been greatly disrupted. Actually, I can see there is a very compelling story that
Just 1 second.
Yeah.
Because we can't see you as well. If David, you could just stop share screen for now, and then we can all see Haoming when he's talking, just Haoming.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Randy. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. So actually, I can see there is a very compelling story that introduced the life cycle of a policy narrative, including the emergence, dominance, transformation, and collapse. So the 2 main actors I can see here are the politicians or government on the one side and China experts or China community on the other side. So what I'm reading from the story that Dr. McCourt shares is that the narrative, if the starting point of this narrative could be started as Nixon and Kissinger's rapprochement policy towards China back to the 70s. And based on the policy needs, the engagement, although at that time, this term didn't exist at time, but like in the subsequent like 80s or 90s, the experts coined this this term, the engagement has gradually become the dominant principles of US-China policy. And once being selected by the politicians, the epistemic community has begun to form and gain influence to reproduce perhaps the supporters of this policy, which have inversely affected the policy decisions for 4 decades and shaped maybe the elites or the leaders' preference for engagement. So this, what I'm thinking, is a very dynamic relations between these two actors. And then an even more interesting point is Trump's election. Perhaps like after Trump's election, we can see like there is a very strong exogenous shock, which has completely disrupted the self-reinforcement of this narrative. And perhaps maybe the China community in the US in general. So the mainstream, as Dr. McCourt has advocated, like the mainstream elites who support the policy are marginalized and divided. And then the subordinate groups who are very strong against this policy can have their voice being heard. So overall, I think this paper is providing a very interesting perspective to look at the U.S.-China policy and explain why the sudden collapse of engagement of the engagement policy in Trump's administration. Here, I want to raise 2 points that which perhaps I think can make the story more compelling, and then end with a very quick question. So first, I think the paper can be more explicit or very more clear about what engagement means in this context. Well, I know that like Dr. McCourt, you shared about the 3 layers of the policy, which includes policy, frame, and community. But when I was reading the piece, first, I think engagement just refers to a certain set of policies that aim to perhaps encourage the friendly US-China ties. But in the latter sections, you also mentioned that the engagers have also participated in the pivot to Asia policy, which is definitely, to my knowledge, not what engagement literally means. So I'm just curious, like where you put this in the 3 layers of your engagement definition. In fact, I think there's one view on American China policy in the past decade suggests that the policy package is not only engagement, but actually a combination of engagement and non-engagement. But like we don't have a good words to describe that. Maybe containment or balancing. I don't know. But that's the meaning of the flip side of engagement. So if this is the case, I think there should be a more interesting story if you can depict how the engagement policy or the groups compete with the other groups. There are 2 narratives in short, then compete with each other through a certain period of time. So engagement seems to dominate in the past like 40 years, but it's now is the turn of containment or balancing. So the collapse of engagement does not perhaps necessarily mean that like the end of engagement, but means the victory of the flip side of engagement, which means that like the appropriate way, which I think to say the US strategy towards China now is in the past 40 years, we have engagement over non-engagement. Now non-engagement takes over, and then engagement becomes the second or subordinate policy. Because even in the end, you say like limited or partial engagement is still necessary for these hogs who advocates for the non-engagement or competition or strategic balancing, that kind of policy. And second point I want to make here is I want to raise the role of China in terms of the sudden collapse of engagement narratives. So because it takes 2 to tango, so Trump's victory in 2016 definitely is an exogenous shock to the US-China community. But I also believe that like Xi Jinping's consolidation of power since 2016 is also another shock, or maybe we can call historical contingency. So as you say, or as you say in the presentation, that some, or in the paper, some interviewees may describe like, hey, like Xi's consolidation of power and then subsequent behavior has sent very strong signals to the US-China community that making the engagement story less and less compelling. So make some of the academics less confident when they talk about the policy or defend the policy. So in that sense, well, I know that IR doesn't have like counterfactuals, but imagine if this doesn't happen, because we see like Trump's first term and Xi Jinping's second term overlaps a lot. There is a very significant overlapping between these two. And Xi Jinping's second term is very significantly different from his first term when he tries to consolidate his power. And so the behavior or the signal that he sends out, I think for me is very different. In that sense, I think the engager may have more voice to be heard. So that's my general comments on the paper. And then finally, I want to have a very quick question with respect to the paper. So you see Trump as a disruption, Dr. McCourt. So do you think the new normal or the US-China policy after the demise of engagement will last? How long do you think it's going to last? In other words, like, will the new government after Trump, either now or 4 years later, bounce back to the engagement policy, or just the new equilibrium of the narrative has been established and won't change that much, even though like Trump or not Trump is there?
Thank you so much, Haoming. That was great. Yeah. So if you have questions, raise your hand. David, go ahead.
Okay, should I just sort of respond while we're collecting some of the questions?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so thanks so much. Really, really great, fantastic questions. And what you see is that the paper that I sent is actually in the process of being revised. And so that's why I brought in sort of what exactly is engagement, try to break it down between policy frame and community. And so what I'm really trying to do is to show that engagement really can't be thought of as a sort of consistent thing. Like Kissinger's engagement is not the same thing as what happened during the Clinton years. Remember, there was actually an interesting pivot to Asia in the mid-2000s that had engagement as a key part of it, even while everyone's eyes were on Iraq and Afghanistan. So what I'm trying to do is explore the idea that engagement is a single thing. There is a sort of a broad idea that you bring China in, but it doesn't help to think about it as a coherent strategy. So how that helps us to think about your points is because, where would the pivot to Asia sort of go? Well, that was a sort of engagement, but what it really does is show that was the manifestation of this broader understanding, and engagement and the debate over its demise is really, as you say, something over the last 4 or 5 years. So it's this post hoc construction. You need to construct something that you can argue against. And in some ways, then you construct the group that argued for it, right? So I'd be surprised if my interviewee 15 years ago would have been able to understand themselves as part of a particular group, because groups go along with frames, right? So the point is that there is a broad overarching viewpoint, but it shifts and changes quite markedly over time. So then the question of, well, what is new? And the newer approach, again, trying to understand it as a policy frame and a community is now being termed strategic competition. And when I started to do these interviews in 2016, 2017, that term hadn't solidified yet. And some people were even putting forward the idea of containment, that might be the new term. And so I saw these people who were trying to sort of coin a new term, and then they realized that containment had all of this baggage to it, and it really didn't capture. And so what you've seen is that what most people, apart from real out there hawks on China, think is that you've got to have engagement in there somehow. And strategic competition is sort of tough enough on China as a framework, yet still allows some cooperation. So even in recent speeches that Mike Pompeo has given that are really meant to sort of announce strategic competition as the new approach, you still say, well, we'll cooperate where we can, right? So I'm trying to foreground the discussion and the debate and the dispute. The fact is that these terms are put out there, but they morph in meaning and sometimes just disappear entirely. So if the engram had continued, you'd have seen a very quick uptick in engagement since about 2016. And it wasn't really talked about very much, I don't think, between around 2005 and 2016 or so. Absolutely, it takes two to tango, and I'm not trying to show that somehow China's expansion into the South China Sea, newfound authoritarianism, events in the western parts of the country are not important. They absolutely are. But it's always about how those things are interpreted, right? So if we think about counterfactuals, yes, the Chinese military is building artificial reefs in the South China Sea, but until about 2016, the US military was interested in joint exercises with China. And you can imagine a situation whereby terrorism is still an important thing in the Philippines and Indonesia. And so the US military is more interested in cooperating with China on anti-terrorism activities rather than getting worried about new bases in the South China Sea. Equally, we could see something on the business lobby side of things. Imagine that the Chinese weren't engaging in forced technology transfers and were inviting US multinationals in still and cooperating with them. You can imagine that the business community would still be putting forward a pro-engagement view. And that would then filter into the types of engagement experts who were involved in politics. So absolutely takes two to tango. It's always, from my perspective, interesting to sort of bring those sort of social groups and social dynamics in. The question of the new normal then, I think you're right. I think that strategic competition is the new framework. I think that any Biden administration would still be bringing in thinkers into the positions that are happy to work within a strategic competition frame and are sort of happy to get along with people who constructed the strategic competition sort of community. So what that means is, that could last, we could be genuinely into a sort of a new Cold War type era in terms of length, in terms of, and I hate to say it, but if you look back in the 1940s and early 1950s, like this is how it worked, right? You got George Kennan in 1947 trying to put forward a very sophisticated understanding of containment of the Soviet Union. Paul Nietzsche comes along and militarizes the whole thing, and it takes us 40 years to get out of it. Unfortunately, I think my paper's going to come out too late. Ultimately, like academia just works too slowly.
I'm going to have to step in. We got a lot of hands. We got very few time. So go for it. So let's step in. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to raise your questions, but we'll wait on David replying till we get the questions. So, yeah. So John, Mueller, you're first.
Okay, could you, I have a couple of questions. One is, could you get the implication is that the policy changes because of the experts changed, but the alternative thing, obviously, they changed the policy and then they picked experts who agreed with them, such as Navarro. Susan Shirk, for example, is maybe an engager, but she's definitely changed her opinion since the early, 10 years ago. But the other question is, do you think China is objectively a threat to American security?
Great. Okay, Andy Goodhart.
Great, thank you. So thanks for sharing the paper. I'm a fifth-year grad student. So I think you capture something really important about changes in this community of experts and in the framing of the problem. And I hear you talking about those three things, right? So the policy shift, the frame shift, and then the shift in who's being listened to. And I think you're right that 2016 saw a shift in frame and in which advisors were prominent. Certainly the national security strategy made clear that engagement was dead and the framing was now going to be more competitive. But I think you overstate the shift in actual policy because Trump was moving us from a hedging strategy that had become more competitive under Obama, but frankly was still balanced, to a strategy that leans more toward competition, but again, sort of, pays lip service to the possibility of engagement, where it's possible. And so I think your argument understates both how competitive the Obama administration was after the so-called pivot, but it overstates how much the Trump administration has done differently in sort of the substantive policy world. So there's clearly a change in the economic space, but in the security space, I think we're talking about sort of changes or sort of acceleration of an existing trend rather than the sort of sudden discontinuity that you frame in the paper.
Great. Tim Luca.
Oh, yeah. Great talk. And actually, I don't really have a damning question. I just want to say.
Then forget it.
Then I should get out. Yeah. But David, I was actually very much looking forward to meet you because we have another shared interest, which is the work on generations you've done, and I wrote my dissertation on. So your book came out, or your chapter, right before I was finishing that. But yes, I just want to say I'm really fascinated by the map you showed there and how you sort of portrayed your talking to these various experts and how those groups shifted. So yes, I would like to talk more about this with you in the future. So I will be in touch, and that's pretty much it. Great talk, very interesting. Thanks.
Great. Let me get just on the attendees side. I'm trying to get people. So let's see, Johannes. I've just allowed you to talk. Let's see if it works.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, nice to meet you. And I guess virtually, I mean, haven't been seen you, I guess, for, I don't know, like 12 years or something like that. Yeah. Anyway, I guess, first of all, it is an interesting question. But second of all, I kind of thinking about several things. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm kind of rambling around, but this is kind of, I find it interesting, like, you know, there's kind of some sort of contradiction here. On one hand, seems to me like every academics that, well, a lot, majority of academics that I talk to kind of saying that, oh, you know, Trump is like overblowing things, like he's an idiot, he didn't really listen to experts and whatever else. But on the other hand, it seems to me like he's actually the one that's setting up the China policy now, especially in the last 2 years after the failure of, well, you know, after the trade talks. So I just kind of wondering, like, how important is Trump here in setting up the entire discourse? Since because I mean, I look at like in like Tom Nichols basically like really hates him, and then, you know, and there's lots of academics didn't take him seriously, but somehow he's the one who set this entire China discourse. So how can you like square that off? I mean, that's one question. Well, I don't know if you can.
Yeah, let's leave it at that because I have more. Thank you, Johannes. Zhao Deng, allowed to talk. Can you talk? Zhao Deng Zhang?
Unmute myself. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, so I think that this engagement really comes from the dramatic behavior changes from China, damaging the world order. You did not mention. I'd like to hear your comments. I'd like to give you several facts. First, Hong Kong security law discontinued the two systems in one country policy, which China honored, make this commitment for 50 years. Number two, establishing the military bases by the rocks in South China Sea, and President Xi honored. President Xi promised President Obama in 2015 in White House. There were no military bases in South China Sea. Third, threatening Taiwan for military unification. I can give you a long list. In Xinjiang, human rights. I think all these things, there's regardless who will be the president, who will be in the White House, I think this engagement will continue until the behavior change. I'd like to hear your comments.
Yeah, and then I had Zhao Yu. Do you want to talk?
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Randy.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I just, yeah, Davey, great paper. I enjoy a lot. I just have maybe 1 or 2 comments. One is that I think when we think about the relationship between power and knowledge, I mean, sometimes we might sort of exaggerate the role of experts in policy process. This is across the board, not just in the United States, but also in China. Nowadays in China, some of the like leading expert of America, they're also put in a sideline to some degree. That's because the political leaders have different ideas. To some degree, they have also sort of motivated reasoning. So they select to hear what they want to hear. So in a sense that I think in terms of the 2016 policy shift in the United States, it's more, I think you lay out some other reasons, but some of the other alternative explanation may be complementary to your main explanation. You need the expertise, the China expert community. Maybe why some of the China experts are putting aside, largely because Trump don't like their views. I mean, he already have some of his idea. The other thing I want to comment is that actually in the Trump administration, a lot of like non-experts put him into a key position, like Peter Navarro. He has problematic credibility in terms of either China or economics, but this is the sort of maybe Trump's decision making has some pattern. He does not like experts across different policy domains. So this is just my two comments, but I think I really like your paper. Really important research.
Yeah, great, thank you. We'll get to David now. I'm almost out of the questions. One thing I noticed was that they were extremely inarticulate, the experts. I don't know, it's just a transcript, but my gosh, they can't put a sentence together. So it was almost unreadable because I think these are experts and they don't speak the English language. But okay, that was one thing that it was just remarkable how inarticulate they were. The other thing is, my reaction to the paper, I thought it was really fascinating. My reaction to the paper, though, is that this is kind of the way the reaction of the experts who have been talking about engagement, and of course, if you say engagement and you say nice things about China, you get invited back to China, you know, which is a nice thing. You know, it's obviously self-serving, right? But my feeling was that it reminded me of like the parallel between like liberals now always use this thing, we believe in science. So now if you disagree with a liberal on a policy matter, well, then you just don't agree with science. And it's kind of like the same thing I was hearing with these experts. The corollary in academia is, well, if you disagree with us, you're just not an expert. You don't know what you're talking about. So we can just, you know, we can just ignore you. And then if you wind up in a position of power, then you just say, okay, Trump just doesn't know, you know, he just likes people that say yes to him. And, you know, they obviously don't know a thing about China. So it is the witch, you know, if you're a witch, you sink. I mean, if you're a witch, you float. And if you're not a witch, you sink, you know? I mean, if you disagree, if you agree with the policymakers, then you believe in science and you're an expert. If you disagree with what's been going on for 20 years, the engagers, then you obviously don't know what you're talking about. Anyway, it's up. I just want to read the Q&A so that people feel that they're, you know, not getting ignored here. Let me get it. If I can't find it for some reason. Let's see. Where is the Q&A? Oh, okay. He says, this is. Oh no, he asked the question. Bin Yu said, looks like DC is not only divided between pro or anti-China experts, but it also divided by those who view Russia as a threat or China as a threat, or both should be contained. What is your comment? Where is the US going now and beyond Trump? And then Glenn Mathis wrote, it appears to me that China is already preparing for further US-China isolation through other foreign engagement strategies like their Belt and Road Initiative and military base in Djibouti. What have you heard regarding the strategy for dealing with a China that is less reliant on US engagement for their wealth and prestige? Okay, it's all yours. Sorry for all that.
Yeah, okay, so I don't think I can pick up on absolutely everything, but
No.
I don't think that's what Q&A is usually for, so that's fine. If anyone wants to sort of reach out in person, that would be interesting. Okay, so I think there's a couple of sort of key themes that come out. And the one is, I think John Mueller sort of mentioned this, and Xiao Yu sort of mentioned this as well, that really it's the policy shifts first, and then they pick sort of experts to fix it, to implement it. I think there's a little something to that, in that Trump does sort of come in with his own views of China, sort of much more skeptical, much more hostile, and a long-standing sort of economic criticism of China. So in his pre-election book, he says, you know, they're stealing our jobs, etc. I think what I'm interested in, though, is the way that doesn't necessarily sort of mean that there's going to be any specific broad shift in America's overall approach to China, or more sort of this shift from engagement to strategic competition. And particularly then the question is raised of, well, how do economic annoyances and grievances get shaped by military security shifts as well? And so I think that really to understand that, you do actually have to understand the types of people that he does end up bringing in, and then the ways in which they then go about framing a new approach slowly over time. It only really has solidified over the last 6 months or so. So certainly it is not purely a case of bringing in a coherent view from an expert community and that going to a new policy. There is certain proclivities in Trump, but I think I'd push back and argue that you need to understand both. The second sort of broad question is to do with change. This is really driven by changes in China and to do with sort of the Hong Kong security law establishing sort of fortified bases in the South China Sea, threatening Taiwan, Xinjiang, human rights violations, etc. Again, I think that it's very difficult to sort of stop oneself and think, well, hang on, when did these things actually happen? When did they become sort of prominent? What is the order of events? So the Hong Kong security law obviously comes in after Trump and therefore has been in the works for a while, presumably, but we need to understand that maybe as a reaction to policies on the American side of things. And also, again, to sort of say, well, yes, we know that these things are bad. We agree that they are bad, but we need to understand why they've been interpreted as such. Again, Tiananmen was awful, but it was interpreted, or it was sort of, it didn't lead to a total rupture in US-China relations because Bush sent over people who wanted to try to keep things smoothed over. Many of these events, I would argue, could have been smoothed over if we'd have wanted to. Now, I'm not saying that they should have been. That's not my perspective. I'm interested in only the sociology of how this works. But they could have been, we could smooth them over if we wanted to. Now, to John Miller's question about is China objectively a threat to US security, I will dodge, because I want to dodge it because I think it's precisely the type of question that could have been used in previous generations, where you want to basically put a political question to someone rather than an academic question to someone. Now, what I would say is that China is understood as a threat to US national security under a new framework now predominant in Washington. And I'm interested in what that framework looks like. China is a threat to America as a global hegemon with a forward defense strategy in East Asia. And from that perspective, issues of threatening Taiwan is an objective threat to that understanding of what the United States is. You know, I'm a constructivist. I think what do we mean by America in the world? Is China coming over here to threaten us in the United States? No, I don't think it is. But as different understandings, you know, so all of the human rights violations in Jiangxing, I think, are awful. But that's not how I understand US national security. I think it ultimately means what's going on with me here. A couple of brief, do I exaggerate the role of experts? I'm really not trying to exaggerate the role of experts. It's just the story I'm telling. I'm really trying to push back against any monocausal explanation. And it might be the case that I'm looking at sort of 15% of the causation, if we want to put it in those kind of terms. But I think it's a really important 15%. And it's one that we don't usually talk about. Tim, let's talk about generations, because there's a really interesting generational story here too, generational turnover in experts and how sort of experts, how they view a country changes over time. So you've got a bunch of young folks in their 30s who have never understood China as anything other than a normal great power competitor. Whereas all of the people in their 60s and 70s grew up with these great views of where China might lead. Andy, that was a great question. Do I overstate policy shift? Well, we'll see. Certainly in the security space and the military space, there's been, I think, an important shift to this new term of great power competition, which might lead to procurement changes. We certainly see no sort of security dialogues going on, like there were going on for a long time. Very few sort of attempts to cooperate. Certainly, you're right, though, it is stronger in the economic space and in domestic politics, the FBI. And I'm interested in that, right? Trump comes in as someone who wants to bash China on the economy. How does it then morph into something different? The economic side and the security side are not the same, yet they become lumped into the same. But you're absolutely right that the policy shift, what I would say is that I think that we'll see more policy shifts in the security military space. That's what I assume, right? Okay, I think I'll stop there.